Welcome. Good morning. I know that it's the semester has ended, and it's good that we have this in-person gathering. And of course, we're also having some online participants. So a big welcome and thank you all for joining us, both personally and also virtually. My name is Lili Yang. I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Education, HKU, and it's such a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Hans de Waet from Boston College to deliver a topic, which you can see the title here. Professor de Waet, I know for people who work in higher education and comparative education, particularly internationalization of higher education, we have read his work. It's must read for students and researchers. And I still recall more than 10 years ago when I started this Master of Arts degree, and one of the very first readings that we were asked to read and engage deeply were from Professor Hans de Waet. And he has been in this field, particularly internationalization of higher education, international higher education for decades. So it's really great that we are having him today to talk about key challenges and trends in international higher education, and particularly implications for internationalization of higher education. So I know that Professor Hans de Waet is a big name and you all know him, but I will still do my chair role and to read his bio. Professor Hans de Waet is Distinguished Fellow of the Center for International Higher Education, CIHE, at Boston College, which is very important and one of the very first centers globally in higher education, international higher education, and Emeritus Professor of the Practice in International Higher Education, Boston College. So from 2015 and 2020, he was full-time director of CIHE, and he's also IAU Senior Fellow by the International Association of Universities. He's also a scientific committee member and teaches in the Higher Education Leadership and Management Doctor of Business Administration, Louis Business School, Rome and Amsterdam. He's also the founding editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education, which is a very important journal in the field. And I think our dean was also involved in the editorial team. And he is also the co-editor of the journal Policy Reviews in Higher Education and a co-editor of the CIHE journal International Higher Education, which publishes short commentary articles. And I've been a really close reader of the journal. He has been involved in quality reviews of internationalization strategies and of internationalization as part of institutional and national quality reviews around the globe. He's author of many books, academic articles, and blogs, essays on internationalization in higher education. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Hans de Waet.
Thank you very much, Lili, and it's a great pleasure and also honor to be here and to talk in this distinguished series of Sierra at Hong Kong University, and great pleasure always to see Dean Yang and other colleagues here, because I think that this center and School of Education and the research that you're doing on higher education is really among the top in the world, and it's very good to be connected. And as some of you have seen on LinkedIn, I've been traveling to mainland China and doing several visits to universities in China, talking about internationalization. And it's quite impressive how the research developing in the Chinese environment, including Hong Kong, on international higher education is evolving and taking a much more leading position. And taking a leading position in what you can say is at the moment a very complicated and troubled time for higher education, not only for higher education, but also for general, for geopolitical developments in our world, and for all the other challenges that we are facing, like climate change, health concerns, etc. And that impacts higher education enormously. So it is important to see how, in what I would call the kind of transition period, what will be the future trends. And so what I'm going to, and we have probably to this one.
You're fixing.
Yeah. Otherwise, I will do it this way, but yeah, then I do it this way. Yeah, it's working now. Yeah, okay. Technology is always still a challenge. Everything. So the themes that I will address is what are global trends in international higher education and how they also impact what we call the internationalization process of higher education, the different perceptions and meaning and the rationales for internationalization and what is shifting in those rationales and meanings, what have been the main trends, and what might be the future rationales and directions in internationalization in response to what is happening in the world. So that will be the topics that I will be addressing. Of course, what is happening in higher education, and my mentor and dear friend, Professor Philip Albach, always says there are two main trends that define what has happened in higher education over the past, let's say, 50 to 70 years. And that's on the one hand, the massification of higher education, and on the second hand, the global knowledge economy. And the massification of higher education, of course, means that there is more demand than supply, in particular from the lower mid-income countries for higher education, and that creates all kinds of challenges. In what we see more recently now, of course, there has been an absorption rate of access to higher education in most of the global north, that includes countries like Japan, Korea, and so there, the massification process is going to stop to a certain extent. There's even more challenges that we don't have enough access to higher education that we need in our countries, which is quite different than still what is happening in the other countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. In particular, Africa, where still there's a very small percentage of the age group that goes to higher education. And so that will be probably the booming area of demand for higher education in the coming decades to go, where, as we have seen, China is already above 50%. India is already around 35% and is aspiring very much to move to get above 50%. We see that in other countries as well, but in most of Africa, it's still below 15%. And so you can imagine that has an enormous impact on higher education. What we see in most countries is that in response to that, we see an increase in private higher education, and in particular in for-profit higher education. In Latin America, already more than 50% of the student body and the universities are private. And that's a trend that you see in Asia, you see it in Africa, you see it in the Middle East, you see it even in China, and even more recently you see in Europe a rise in private higher education as well. But that's for quite different reasons. That has much more to do with the trend for more professional education, which the research universities don't respond to sufficiently. But so massification has an enormous impact, and has also an impact, of course, on internationalization. It means that if there's not enough supply for higher education in the local context, students go abroad, and parents send them abroad, and even government stimulates them to go abroad. And that's what we have seen over the past 50 years. We have seen that from a number of something like 300,000 40 years ago, we now have nearly 7 million students that are studying abroad, which is an enormous increase. And that increase has been in particular from the global south, and in particular from Asia and China and India as leading countries. And that increase is important to keep in mind when we talk about the process of internationalization. At the same time, what we see is that now, and we will discuss that later, that there is an anti-international students movement in North America, Australia, the UK, and Europe going on, which is not welcoming international students anymore. And at the same time, also there's an increasing movement of South-South mobility. So in particular, movement from Chinese students who don't feel that they can come to Europe or the United States, going to Hong Kong and going to the rest of Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. And we see similar trends with African students. African students don't go to Europe, don't go to North America. They go in particular to within the region or to Malaysia or to China, and are now much more welcomed, even with scholarships, maybe sometimes to an extreme of scholarships given, but that's part of soft power policy as well. So massification has an enormous impact on internationalization, but also you have to see the constantly shift in trends in that development happening. And then, of course, we have the second one, is the global knowledge economy. That's the fact that higher education has become really, in the past decades, a driving force for innovation and change and development. And as a result of that, we have seen the development of excellence initiatives, China being a very clear example, but we have seen the 1-500 projects in Russia, we see it in Germany, we see it in France, we see it in Japan. We see it elsewhere, that universities, governments say, well, we cannot increase the overall quality of higher education, but we have to invest in certain world-class top universities to be competitive in the knowledge economy. And also that has an enormous impact on the internationalization, because universities are looking for the best students internationally, they're looking for the best faculty internationally. They compete for the best positions in rankings, they compete for the best access to top journals, and that trend has given an enormous increase in a different way than the massification to the internationalization of higher education. So those trends and the related aspects of the role of rankings and excellence initiatives and the increasing privatization of higher education, and also differentiation, the difference between the top world-class universities and the rest of the higher education sector, that's all manifested also in this internationalization. And that trend has constantly grown and also impacts to a certain extent what has been the dominance of the Western higher education system, now being competed by institutions from the global South, in particular from China, and of course Hong Kong has always had a very strong position and continues to have that strong position. But you see that in particular China, but also some countries like Singapore, have an increase in the top rankings as world-class universities. And that kind of a shift that is also very important to keep in mind. And what we've seen is a changing global economic and social and political environment in the past 5 years. We see that there is increasing anti-science movements in the global north, and particularly the United States, but we see similar trends in the UK, we see it in Europe, not so extreme as in the United States under the Trump administration, but still there is this kind of anti-knowledge economy trend from a political movement. We see anti-immigration trends, and that means also anti-international students, which incorrectly are seen as immigrants, which they are not, they only become immigrants after the graduation and they stay, but still in the whole discourse, you see that international students are seen as immigrants, and since there is an anti-immigration movement, that also impacts the development of recruitment of international students, and that's clear in visa policies, but that's also in other ways that the governments in the global north are restricting everything. And there is the anti-collaboration movement. There is a strong focus on national security issues. Governments are correctly not, of course, there's always misuse of higher education. That's part of what we know, that higher education is not perfect. There is a lot of corruption, there's a lot of fraud. We just published a book on corruption in higher education with Philip Albach and Lili Smith about all kinds of different cases. But the trend in particular in the global north is, and you see that in the policies of the European Commission, you see it in the policies of the United States, is that now they say, well, we have to protect our knowledge against misuse by foreign intervention, by espionage, by theft, etc. That trend also means that there is a kind of anti-international collaboration in higher education movement from the political side. Of course, the irony is that the private sector in all those countries are contra these policies of the governments, because we see for demographic reasons that there's a shortage of skilled labor in our private sector. We see that the big tech companies, including even Elon Musk, needs those international students, that they need the international collaboration that we have seen during the COVID crisis, that we need to collaborate research together to create vaccines. So there is this kind of strange contradiction happening in the global north between politically anti-science, anti-knowledge, anti-universities, anti-students, anti-faculty, and at the same time, the pressure from the private sector that we need them. So there's no clear answer what will be the winning team. Probably they have find some balance between that, but at the same time, it has a negative impact. So there's also anti-science in the sense of anti-climate research, anti-health research, etc. We see that very clearly of course, in the United States in particular. So that's all happening. And as a result of that, we see also concerns about autonomy and academic freedom, and related to that, other issues, ethical issues. It is quite ironically that until recently, the perception was in the global north, in the Western world, higher education was autonomous and academic freedom was high on the agenda. There was no one objecting to the fact that academic freedom was essential as a value of higher education. And even in worse now, the ministers of education in the Bologna process in Europe, and we talk about 45 different countries, they just declared in their latest meeting that the academic value, so autonomy, academic freedom, access of participation of students and scholars in higher in governance, academic integrity, and responsibility of society for higher education for society. Those are the 4 common academic values, they say, that they are still important. But the reality is, and I'm part of the Council of Europe expert group that does research on academic freedom in the European context, that academic freedom and autonomy is very much under challenge. It's under challenge, autonomy, because of severe budget cuts on higher education and attacks on the academic profession as being tenureship, etc., and continuity, and all those factors. Academic freedom is under pressure because of political motivations and so on. So there is a really big concern, and that concern is even much bigger in the United States than in Europe. So in the past, we could always claim, well, China and other nationalist countries they are attacking autonomy, they are against academic freedom. No, it's worse now. I was talking with the dean about it just before. When I was in China now, I could openly talk about the fact that academic freedom and autonomy are under attack everywhere, including China. If I do that now in the United States in certain universities, I will be in trouble. So, I mean, in that sense, also the situation, unfortunately, is shifting. And this all has to do with all kinds of strange perceptions that people have in the political environment. And the fact even, I mean, I was at Beijing Normal, students came to me in the discussion publicly and said, do you really think that people in the United States and Europe consider Chinese as being academics as being thefts and spies? And the fact is that, of course, there are people saying that publicly in the United States and in Europe. And then I said, well, that's the irony. We first invite students from China and from other parts of the world to come to our countries and charge them big money. And so we make profit out of them. And then when they go back and they use that knowledge, then they are suddenly thieves and spies. I mean, that's the irony, of course, of the whole debate which is happening. And we struggle as institutions of higher education very much to deal with that. So So that's a big challenge that we face now with all this kind of concerns about academic values that are attacked. And of course, in that also the whole role of digitalization and artificial intelligence also has an enormous impact on what is happening in higher education. And we still don't know the outcome. We see the opportunities and we see also the ethical concerns and challenges with that. So we are in a very important, complicated, but also transitional period. And in that, what is internationalization? Of course, we can study everywhere, and the Dean has done interesting research about that, also about how higher education in China already was international a long time, many centuries ago. The same was in Africa, the same was in the Middle East, and of course also we always talk about the Renaissance period in the European context, that students and scholars were traveling around the world. So that was always international. But internationalization as a strategy of universities and as a conceptual framework, that's still rather new. And that's more from this late 1980s, early 1990s, when on the one hand, the end of the Cold War made the dominance of the two superpowers less strong. And so there was a very period of hope and excitement of international collaboration, and we need to work together, we need to exchange, we need to do everything. And also in the European context, of course, there was the policies of the European Commission that stimulated very much the internationalization process in that region as well. So that all created a kind of enthusiastic atmosphere. But we have to be aware that internationalization means something completely different depending on what stakeholder you are and in which context you operate. Internationalization means something completely different from Harvard University than Boston College, although we are only 3 miles away from each other. Harvard is a world-class university, the same you can say of MIT. It has even the perception that they don't have to have an internationalization strategy because they are world-class anyway. Where Boston College is a national research university, a Jesuit Catholic with a mission in social justice, etc., and they have to define their international strategy in a different way. And sometimes even in no way, because, I mean, the Center of International Education, which was founded by Philip Albach, and I was also a director, was an island in Boston College. Everybody in the world knew the center in higher education, knew the Center of International Education, but nobody knew about Boston College because that was a college, was not a university. It is a university. And by the way, also not in Boston, but still. But each strategy is quite different depending on the context of the institution, the context of the country, etc. And it's driven by different rationales. There are political rationales, in particular by governments, but also sometimes by institutional leaders. There are economic motivations why you have to internationalize. That can move from revenue generation, which of course is very strong in countries like Australia and the UK, but it can also be because you have to prepare for the economic labor market. So that's important. You have social and cultural motivations why you have to internationalize, and of course you have also academic and educational ones to increase the quality of what you're doing. So context and rationales and stakeholders are very important in understanding what we mean with internationalization, and they change over time constantly. Internationalization meant something completely different when I started as the director of the International Office of Tilburg University in Nederland in 1981. To when I was vice president for international affairs in 1995, when I became a professor in 2005, and so on. And even it will be quite different in the next 10 decades. And we have institutions that claim to be comprehensive international strategy, and others where it is very fragmented and ad hoc. So context, again, is very essential. There's not one model that fits all. And that's very important to keep in mind. So the political I addressed already, and again, they are can be quite different even subcategories of what we are doing. And you have always asked yourself, why are we internationalizing? And what are the main rationales what you're doing? There's not one driving rationales, there are many ones, but it's very important to keep that in mind. Very briefly, historically about internationalization. So before it was even a concept, a strategy, but after the Second World War, international activities were rather fragmented. It was mainly the mobility of a small elite from the former colonies that went with scholarships to go to study in the global north. And there was a lot of development cooperation. Countries and institutions gave money to support the development of higher education in the global south. And big programs like the USA, for instance, the United States, the Scandinavians, the Dutch, the Germans, the DRD, etc. They gave a lot of support by sending faculty to the global south, by giving scholarships, by building infrastructure, etc. There was, of course, national security. There was a power relationship. So many of the international programs in the United States were basically built on power, creating programs for language courses, creating programs for international studies, to know what was happening else in the world so that they become much more dominated. And the Soviet Union did exactly the same. We were competing in the battlefield between the two. And there was a lot of soft power. So internationalization as a kind of knowledge diplomacy, as my colleague Jay Knight recently writes about. When Nixon started to collaborate with China, the first thing he did was, of course, playing table tennis. But the second one was signing agreements for exchange of students and scholars and academic collaboration. And that you have seen when the Soviet Union fell apart, Germany did exactly the same. And that's a quite important factor in that side. So the driving rationale was basically politically. And universities didn't really have an active, but much more a reactive role in that process. So after the end of the Cold War, we see this whole enthusiasm, the period of hope. We have to collaborate, etc. But there were two countries which were a little bit of an exception. There were the UK and Australia. And the Margaret Thatcher and an Australian colleague around 1980, there were severe budget cuts by the Thatcher administration on higher education. So he said, well, we stopped to give free access to higher education from the Commonwealth and other international students. You can now charge full cost fees. And that was a substantive difference in the way of their international policies. And to everybody's surprise, even if you read scholars around higher education around that time, in commentaries, including even Philip Albach, they thought the UK and Australia will completely lose the number of international students. Because why would you go to pay £10,000 to go to the UK when you can get free education in Germany or in France or the Netherlands, etc., Scandinavia? Why would you do that? And the opposite has happened. The numbers has enormously increased. And the main rationale why we think that has happened is value for money. If you think you have to pay something high and you know the quality of the institution, or better said, the reputation of the institution is good, parents and students prefer to go there. Governments even prefer to give scholarships for students to go there because they think then the return on investment is pretty high. So that's happened, and that's what we see then at the turn of the century happening elsewhere as well. Canada started to do it, countries like the Netherlands, even Scandinavia is doing it now. They start full cost fee, and they saw the number increasing. They also saw the inequality increasing because what happens, students from families that have money, they can send their children abroad, but poor families with kids that are probably as bright or maybe brighter, they couldn't go abroad. So for instance, in Scandinavia, we have seen that where a large majority of the international students before came from countries like Africa, etc., now they get mostly students from Asia and from Central Eastern Europe. So it shifts the pattern of what is happening as well. What we also see in that time, we see what we see is the shift, as my colleague Marijk van der Wende said, the shift from competition to cooperation, from cooperation to competition. And where in the past the trend was we have to collaborate, we have to exchange students, we have to exchange scholars, we have to do research publications, we have to development cooperation. Now we compete. We compete for the best international students, or we compete for international students to make money. We compete for the best scholars. We compete for positions in the rankings. We compete for access to top publications. Competition became much more a driving force. Of course, it didn't stop collaboration, because if you compete, you also have to make choices with whom you collaborate, but still the shifting focus has been very much competition. And we see gradually the Western dominance disappearing, and there's much more the development of a global internationalization strategy. We know that most higher education is dominated by the Western models, but now you see that that is gradually shifting. You see that the countries say, well, also we have to develop our internationalization strategy. That's what China is doing, that's what Korea is doing, that is what Colombia is doing. Many countries are now developing their own strategy. And we see also, and I come back to that, a movement away from what we call education abroad, the focus on mobility, to a much more focus on global learning for all and internationalization at home. Because we have become, and there was a counter reaction, realizing that you can talk about the increase from 300,000 to 6 to 7 million international students, and you can talk about the increase of mobility of faculty. The reality is that still only worldwide, less than 2% of the people in academia are mobile. So if you focus your internationalization strategy as institutions, as governments, exclusively on mobility, then you do something completely wrong. Then you are very elitist and exclusive in your internationalization strategy. And that consciousness is still very early, and I come back to that. And what we see now, and I mentioned that, we see that political rationale is again taking over a little bit from the economic rationale in the past decades. We see since 5 years that political motivations become much more driving by governments. And that creates all kind of negative impact on the way we internationalize. So very briefly, if you look at the past 50 years, it is pretty much moving from an ad hoc strategy to a much more comprehensive strategy, and it is on the agenda of all kinds of entities. I'm involved as a senior fellow in the International Association of Universities Global Surveys. We see that now probably 3/4 of universities around the world have an internationalization strategy or have incorporated internationalization as part of their core strategy. So that's quite impressive. And we see that indeed also several governments have strategies. And it's still driven by very different rationales. And if I ask here what internationalization means, I get a completely different answer when I go to the Australia, or when I go to the United States, or when I go to Colombia or the Netherlands, because the context is very different. And the motivations and the rationales why they're doing it are there also very different. So it is still very complex. But mobility, as I mentioned, is still the driving force. Mobility of students, mobility of for full degrees, mobility for students with credits, mobility for language courses, faculty mobility for research, faculty mobility for teaching, and program mobility. What we call transnational education, branch campuses, franchise operations, articulation programs, dual degree programs, they are on the rise. They have been there for quite some decades, but now, in particular, also in reaction to what is happening in the political context, we see now that transnational education is pretty booming. And I come maybe back to that. But as a result of that, we see the fight between the global north and the south. The inequality is still very is more stronger than ever before. But there are exceptions like here and some other countries, Singapore, etc., that where they are on the rise, but the inequality still is very dominant. And also the inequality between the top world-class universities and the rest of the higher education system. And again, we're talking about 1,500 maximum of institutions in the rankings. What are really world-class universities? Maybe 200. How many research-intensive universities are in the world? I had a whole discussion with Jamil Salmi, Alan Hedekorn, and Philip Albach about can we quantify the number of what are research-intensive universities? We couldn't come to an agreement. At the end, we said there's something between 400 and 1,000 in the world. And since there are probably around 40,000 institutions of higher education, it's a very small percentage. So the inequality there is very high as well. So internationalization has become much more synonymous with competition and marketization, and inequality has increased very much. And so I'm also conscious about the timing. Those things have to do a lot of things. So, no problem at all. I perfectly know that from my experience when I was vice president to do the same. Internationalization is a very multifaceted and constantly evolving concept. Even to the extent that internationalization means everything and nothing in mind. Because it's so broad, it's so general, and come back to the original definition of J. Knight, and there has been, as some of you might have seen, a whole debate with Simon Markinson about that. Internationalization basically describes that you are internationally and interculturally and globally active. Nothing more than that, in that definition. So we have to be much more clear, what are we talking about in each context, what is internationalization? And the same applies to other terms that we use. We use the term international students, but there is not something like the international student. There are degree-seeking students at the bachelor level, at the master level, the PhD, and by that different level, they are already completely different. There are credit-seeking students that go as part of their home degree for a short period abroad. There are what we call certificate international students that only go there for professional development or language courses, etc. And the same applies to, and then we have the virtual ones, which makes life even more difficult. What is, when you are in an international operation, are you really an international student when you are staying at home and you do a course abroad, or are you a local student? Probably both. And that applies to also what we mean with internationalization at home. There are many different opinions about that. Transnational cross-border education, digitalization, there's a huge difference between the distance education program and a virtual exchange program, for instance. All that kind of terms that are very much used in a very vague way. So I mentioned that already. Skip that. So we confuse and mix very key questions when you talk about internationalization. You have to ask yourself, why is an institution? Why is a government? Why is a program internationalized? That's the first and fundamental question. And in that, you have also to look at, well, what is the intended outcomes of your internationalization strategy? So what do you want to reach? And then you can talk about what are you doing it, with whom are you partnering to make it happen, and how are you going to organize it, and in which context you are going to happen. But those first two questions, the why and the impact, in all the strategies that I have been involved around the world in evaluating or trying to convince them to set up a strategy, they try to ignore those two questions. They just start, oh yeah, we have seen that the university set up a memorandum of understanding and they exchange some nice students, or let's do that as well. Or we see that universities are moving up in the rankings, and what do the rankings say? We have to have more international students, we have to have more international faculty, and we have co-publications. So let's do that strategy. So they copy and they look externally, but they don't think about their strategy. That's one of the most fundamental problems that we face. And the same is with rationales. read that. So going back to what I said before, mobility or internationalization abroad, that's the component that people talk about when they talk about internationalization. And that has been driving policies by institutions, that have been driving policies by governments. That's even what students do and their parents do. They want to be mobile. But again, this is 2% worldwide. In the United States, it's probably 10%, mainly because of undergraduate mobility of students that go abroad, and by the fact that they have a lot of international students. But even the number of international students in the United States is only very minor in the total student population, if you compare it, for instance, to the UK and Australia. So mobility is very marginal. This is what all students concerns. So if you want to have an internationalization strategy, this is much more important, and the mobility becomes one of the ways to reach that, but only one of the many ways, and only for a very small percentage. How can we create a campus environment which is much more international? What can we do to internationalize the curriculum? How can we teach and learn in a much more international way? How can we develop joint programs together? And what kind of competencies and learning outcomes do students need? That should be much more important in the internationalization strategy. And that's what basically we saw around the turn of the century gradually happening by three different movements. The internationalization at home movement in Europe, which said, well, in Erasmus, we have 95% of students that are not mobile in the Erasmus scheme. So what can we do to make them more international? In Australia and also to the UK, several people said, well, okay, we have all those international students, and something like 25%, even now there's one university, Deakin University, has I think 51% of their students is international. But what do we learn then? And what do we learn our own students? We should be thinking much more about it, so we have to develop that strategy. In the United States, it was much more, we have to be comprehensive international strategy. We should not only do exchange of students and students recruitment, but we should look at all aspects of internationalization. We saw the critique of internationalization as being a Western paradigm. I wrote already about that with Elspeth Jones in 2012, the first time. And now you see that the whole movement of scholars that are working on decolonization of internationalization and of higher education as a very important perception of, we should not think that what is done in the West is excellent and should be copied by the rest of the world. You have to develop an own strategy. And you see that there's a movement to say, well, the internationalization of research, the other mission, and internationalization for society, the third mission. Those two missions, research and service to society, were pretty much ignored in internationalization strategies. For two reasons. One is with internationalization of research, well, everybody that talks about research think, well, that's by nature international, so we don't have to have a strategy for that. But you need a strategy in a complex world where there's much more need for collaboration, where there's much more need for support to develop strategies, etc. So that makes it important. And the third mission is everything to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. If we not work bridging local and global needs, then we do something wrong. So that are very important movements, but still those are very much written down in scholarly reports and policy documents, but in action, also again in the global survey of the International University, we don't see much of really concrete action. We still see that governments and institutions focus very much on the mobility side of internationalization. And we don't integrate internationalization in all other aspects of what we are doing in our higher education community. And that shift is very essential, even much more now in the current context than ever before. If universities are not preparing their students to be much more globally competent, if they're not focusing on what do they have to learn in their discipline by comparing, by they only use Western-dominated documents, but we don't mix the experience with the Confucius model with the Western model and see what we can learn from each other and how we can bring the good out of both of them. That is something which we are still missing. So that's what's very essential in the internationalization. Should be, but still not is, unfortunately. And so you see all those labels trying to emphasize that there is a much more need for what we call a normative direction of what should internationalization do. Comprehensive, intelligent, ethical, conscientious, responsible, humanistic. I could probably mention even more. We see now a term, global engagement, as a kind of term happening in many documents. They all felt, well, there is something wrong with the way we look at internationalization. And we did in 2015 for the European Parliament a kind of Delphi exercise, because they asked us, we get all those proposals by the European Commission for Horizon money, for international collaboration, Erasmus, but what is internationalization? And so we thought, well, we ask scholars and university leaders around the world and ask them, what should be the case? And they said, well, internationalization of higher education has become much more inclusive and less elitist, so it has not to focus on those 2%. Mobility in itself, there's nothing wrong with it, but if it is isolated from what you do in the curriculum, it becomes some kind of academic tourism. And maybe fine for the individual, but not for the whole curriculum and development. It should re-emphasize internationalization, not a goal in itself, but a means to enhance the quality of what we are doing in higher education, and should not be driven only by making money, be other economic rationales. And so, we originally called it a definition. I call it now much more a direction, because if you get into debates about definitions, you get lost in a whole kind of semantic discourse, etc. So I say this is a direction. The original definition, as I mentioned, is from J. Knight, the process of integrating an international, intercultural, global dimension to the purpose, functions, and delivery of post-secondary education. It basically says, as I said, we have to internationalize. And that's an ongoing process. And itself, that was at that time when she developed it in 1993, and we were working on it in the 1990s for the OECD and for UNESCO and the World Bank. In itself, that was a big step forward, because there was no process. But if you keep it like that, everybody can interpret it in its own way. Then internationalization. So when I went to Australia with J. Knight in the 1990s, and we were presented that at the conferences for international education, they said, yeah, that's fine. So we are going to recruit international students to make money. That's our way of internationalization. So, and even J. Knight still thinks that's the right approach. Everybody has to decide how they do their strategy. But we thought that should be much more normative. You have to make changes. You have to make changes. So it has to be an intentional process. So it cannot go by itself. You have to have the intention of the different stakeholders to make it happen. And it has to have a purpose to enhance the quality of what we are doing in education and research. It has to not to be only for those 2% of the students, but for all students and staff, and it has to make a meaningful contribution to society. And that's, again, my view, and I corrected that, not a definition, but it's a direction. That's the normative direction we have to go. And that's where I also agree with Simon. I think Simon Markinson's critique on J. Knight's definition was ignoring the historical context in which that definition developed. But he is right in the sense that that definition has become much more the synonym of the Western dominance of the paradigm. It has to be much more open, and it has to be much more service oriented to what we do in higher education. So I'm somewhere in between the two in that debate, and that's always the best position to be in. But I think it's important to make that normative approach. And again, that all applies to what we have been doing now. It's even more important that universities have an international strategy which is focused on collaboration, which is focused on service to society, which is focused on all students and staff and not on a small elite. That's increasingly more important in the way we are now operating in our societies. And so, because if we are seeing political rationale are driving the end again, but in a negative way, where you can say that in the after the Second World War, there was still some positive dimension to the way that governments operated. Now it is blocking. With knowledge security, again, also blocking international collaboration, where we need to collaborate internationally. We have to look into the conflict which I mentioned between anti-immigration and the need of skilled labor. And to a certain extent, you can ironically say even that's positive in the sense that the anti-immigration policy reduces the brain drain from the global south. But at the same time, we have to be aware about the reality. So economic rationale, revenue generation is still an important factor. And if you only follow what is happening now in the United Kingdom, which is what the government does with new levies, etc., and other policies to reduce the international students, that is disastrous for the economy of higher education in the United Kingdom. Many universities, not the Oxford and Cambridge, they will survive, not the top ones, but the rest is really in big problems, and that we see elsewhere as well. We have to emphasize again the academic values as a driving force for internationalization. We see that countries like China and Singapore and others are becoming much more important and addressing the dominance, and that's in itself a positive development. And we see that digitalization and AI are becoming key instruments. And again, there are many opportunities there. We can use AI much more to get more big data and information resources in our research. We can have the possibility of access to all that kind of information for students. We can open our service improvements, etc. All those positive things are there, but there are all kind of other dangers that we have to address as well. The danger of who controls that information, what is the right information and what not. And we see that probably in the future, the role of faculty in addressing those concerns and directing and learning students to have the right information and using the right data, etc., becomes also a very important part in higher education in general and internationalization. And that's some recommendations on the future to end, make the third mission of higher education much more central, because we as universities have an obligation to serve society by our research to solve the problems that are local and global. Intercultural becomes much more part of internationalization. Ironically, in universities, there are two separate domains. Universities have offices for intercultural and cultural and international, but they are connected. And the local and the global, is also much different. Fundamental academic values are important. Climate change focuses, bottom-up initiatives, and creating the right balance between security on the one hand and international collaboration. We cannot ignore that there are security issues. But if we leave it to the governments to define with whom we can collaborate and what we can do together, then we are in big danger. That is the responsibility that we have as universities here and everywhere. And with that, I hand forward.
Thank you very much, Professor De Wit. I already see hands up, and we're doing pretty good with time, so we can take questions both from the room and also from online. So Hugo, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans, for the very comprehensive. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive analysis and assessment of internationalization, its definitions and applications. I'm wondering about language, because I think language is very critical here. On the one hand, promotes equality in terms of the ability that allows us to communicate with one another. We are communicating here in English, Most of us are not native English speakers. On the other hand, it promotes inequality in the sense that we privilege one language over all the others. And actually, the language might even explain how internationalization is connected to opportunities. I mean, the example that you provide with Mrs. Thatcher putting fees for international students and still succeed has to do a lot with language. Let's be honest about it, because it's with possibilities, because kids all over the world start learning English. Therefore, you know, the initial investment is already made. Then they go to the UK, they can get a job there. If they can't get a job there, they can go to the US, Canada, Australia, all developed countries. If you think about German, for example, sure, I can go to Germany. I have to learn a new language. Germany is not particularly an easy language. And then what? If I don't make it in Germany, I go where? Austria, and that's it. So all of these are quite important issues because they still relate to opportunities for internationalization. And at the same time, it relates to culture. So interestingly, even in China, even in the other poles that are now emerging, English continues to be the language of instruction and of communication, which creates problems, but also allows for these poles to emerge. So how do you see language in all of these scheme of things? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, no, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Of course, language is indeed a very controversial and important debate in that. English is the second language most used in the world. That's not the main language. The first language is the second language for everybody. And that makes it a good language of communication and interaction. And that has created all kinds of possibilities, but at the same time, it dominates. So the use of language in research already is for a long time, dominating the access to publications, etc. So in that sense, it gets a negative aspect because it makes it more elitist. If you don't have a good language skills, you cannot do the right research publications. And the same thing you see increasingly with teaching. So what happened again in the 1990s when we saw that the universities were much more going international, and that applies to my job when I was at the University of Amsterdam. My students wanted to go abroad. They wanted to go to Australia, they wanted to go to the United States, they wanted to go to Canada, to England, and everywhere. And there was no problem for them because they knew their languages. But in particular Americans, but many other countries, English-speaking countries, they don't know other languages, and so they wouldn't come. So I said, well, we cannot have any exchange agreements because we will be in imbalance. So I said, well, let's start to teach in English as well, some courses specifically to make it happen. And that worked very well, and students came, and we had more and more exchange programs. And then students started to ask foreign students, said, well, why can't I get a degree? Why don't I get a master's degree or a bachelor degree? So I talked with some of the deans, and we said, why we don't develop some degree programs also in English? And that worked pretty well. And that you saw happening elsewhere in Europe also, that we were, even Germany and France started to teach in English in certain programs. So that was to a certain extent essential development in making also be more competitive with the global 4 Anglophone countries. But we have gone to the extreme. We have gone to the extreme in the sense that we universities thought, oh yeah, there's international students come. The government then says you can charge them full cost fees, so you can make money out of that. So we started to do all kinds of crazy programs in English, like psychology, which otherwise would have probably been closed to too few students. We saw even cases in the university that if you wanted to learn Dutch language, that you had to write your thesis in English because that was international. So there has been, in that sense, a negative development. What we also see that it creates all kinds of tensions with an international classroom environment. If you have an international student which has not English as their major they cannot actively engage in a classroom because the local students who are fluently in English then dominate the interaction with the teacher. And teachers are not very good in realizing that, so we have to train teachers much more to do that. But it is quite obvious. Even in my classes in Boston, I started every class with a kind of practice where I said to 3 students, 2 international, 1 local one, go to discuss among yourselves, and then at the end you have to present what you have been talking. And always the local students was the one that talked. And the international students were shy. I mean, so that learned also the local students, they had to be much more aware. It is a major problem, the language, in the sense of language instruction. If it is not your local language, it's quite urgent. There's not a very easy solution to that. I mean, you have to have a language of communication, but you should not exaggerate. I still remember when I was in Colombia, and I was at a nursing school in a rural area, a very indigenous population. And the government of Colombia, and there are many other governments in other global south countries, say that every student that is in university at the end has a level of B1 or B2 or C1 English, the high level. And those students are struggling enormously because they have never a chance to practice it. And so he said, it costs me an enormous amount of time, and it goes at the cost of learning them to be good nurses, etc. So I said, you have to attack the government for doing that, because 99% of your nurses are going to work in the local environment. They're going to work with local indigenous populations, so they have to learn other skills much better than learning English. And that's, so there is this kind of dominant feeling of language being important. And at the same time, we need this language of communication also on teaching and learning. We don't know what is happening with AI. There's some people who are very positive to say, well, at a certain moment, you don't need to know foreign languages anymore because you have some chip in your head where you automatically translate to another language, which can also be very dangerous, by the way. Do you still understand the cultural background about that? I was talking with Professor Wen on this issue as well, and she said, well, one of the interesting things is when artificial intelligence is using language in the Chinese context, and artificial intelligence in the American context or the European Western context is using English as the language of how you develop artificial intelligence, you get a complete culture clash. And we're not preparing for that. So, I mean, it's a very fascinating but also not very easy problem. We have to address that.
But by the way, there's already in China, there's already a company that you put a kind of earplug, and the other person as well, and you can talk your language, and it will automatically translate to the other person in the other person's language. So this is already a reality. We don't need to put the chip for it.
No. Even I got in the symposium that we organized in Tsinghua, some of the people were in Chinese and some were in English, and I got an iPad which automatically translated. The translation was, by the way, terrible. So there still needs progress, but that was with Google Translate as well.
Thank you. I'm using that. I recommend that notebook, so it automatically transcribes what you said and translate in Chinese or in other languages.
Hopefully that's better than it was in Chinese.
Thank you for bringing up the language question, because language is nowadays the use of English is considered as an indicator of internationalization of universities across the world. And also language is not only about students to speak, but also an access to the culture, knowledge of a different system, and that brings another whole area of potential dangers, tensions, and also potential losses that we don't have access to those cultures and knowledges. Okay, we will take 2 more questions and then we move on to the online questions. Hi, first.
Thank you so much. I learned quite a bit. I have one question and one potential challenge. So one question was, I was very interested in your discussion about normative agenda for internationalization, and that we need some sort of like normative ideals of how this internationalization should look like. But I was also wondering, like, who should be taking the charge? would it be academic leaders like J.W.M, or would it be like government officials? And I was wondering what your thoughts were. Number two, you seem to be kind of like concerned with this inward-looking trend. And I wanted to challenge that a little bit. What if like the inward-looking trend leads to some sort of like epistemic empowerment of formerly colonized countries? For instance, medical research is extremely westernized. But when I came to Hong Kong, which is about 1 year ago, I learned that there's quite a bit of medical research done on Chinese medicine, which I think has been neglected quite a bit in the international sort of medical research scene. And that to me points to, and there's no other region of the world that's doing research, the randomized control studies on Chinese medicine, right? Except for Chinese mainland and Hong Kong. But maybe that could be a good thing, and that like you're sort of like this sort of temporary epistemic segregation kind of like leads to empowerment of like research landscape of China and Hong Kong. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. Both two interesting points. On the first one, I think there has to be a common ground. I mean, you cannot say it has to only be the dean, or it has to be the president of the university, or it has only to be the faculty. All the stakeholders, even outside of the institutions, have to be involved. But you have to try to make bridges in doing that. And there are some common interests. I mentioned the private sector is probably very much interested in what kind of skills people need for the future, and the international dimension of that is also very important. So you have to do it from top down to a certain extent, but you also have to stimulate the possibilities to do it from bottom up. So you have to find the right balance between those two. If students come with good proposals, if faculty come with proposals, then try to build on that as university leaders. But also university leaders have to say, well, it's our responsibility to create the right education and to create the right research that serves to society. So my view, it's not easy. Also, there's all this pressure that university leaders and governments have to be quantitative in their showing of results. So they are much more interested in how many international students do we have, how many exchange agreements do we have, how many research grants internationally have, what is our position on the rankings. They can clearly communicate that. It's much more difficult to convince them, well, what do we do with changing of the curriculum to make it much more international? And also, we still are in a very early stage of work on what do we mean with that. So one of the topics I suggested to Zhejiang University are doing research on, can we do an inventory of what the universities, the world-class universities in China are, what kind of indicators they have to create a much more internationalized curriculum. So what is there already and what they need to do. That kind of research we still have to find. What does it mean an international curriculum in different disciplines? Because it might be quite different in education than it is in engineering or in medicine. So we have to be working both bottom up and top down at the same time. Yeah, and on your second question, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned medicine as an example, because I use that example in like some of my talks in mainland China as well, that I actually find that the opposite of inward looking. Because what has happened is the Western world has a very clear perception from our medicine is the best of the world, and we have developed that. And then you have Chinese medicine. And there was this negative trend for a long time that we didn't consider Chinese medicine as real. Acupuncture, that was kind of, and all those other excellent things that you have developed in medicine, were considered as not being useful. You have seen that shift. And now it is quite common to use Chinese experiences in medicine in Europe. And the same way, you have also seen that the Chinese medicine also uses a lot of Western models. So you have to bridge much more. That's not inward looking. You have to look into what can we learn from other different cultural developments? What can we learn not only from Chinese medicine, but also what is happening in Africa with medicine and in indigenous communities in Latin America? So we have to break those kind of national boundaries between what is traditionally developed as the kind of dominant force and see how we can work together to make the collaboration and to use what is good from one side and what is good from the other side together. That's a different way of looking at it than looking at blocking and inward looking.
Thank you. Thank you. Jason, you have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the really inspiring talk. I just want to hear your perspective about the internationalization at home, whether you see this as a sort of can be really alternative or replacement to this for the physical mobility of internationalization, or it's going to be really supplementary role in the future. I'm asking this question because I'm from Korea. We had these French campuses, several efforts and several policies, but none of them was really successful because people don't see it as a real internationalization. Either you go to top elite university internationally, or you go to real university, but this is always kind of second labeling, second tier French campus. They don't see it as an internationalization. So in this kind of context, and then you are also talking about, for the climate change, we have to think of these alternative ways to travel less, et cetera, et cetera. So what's your view of this kind of French campus internationalization at home, whether it can be really an alternative way? Thank you.
Well, of course, the branch campuses is one very specific element of internationalization at home. And what we see is quite interesting. The branch campuses were mainly coming from Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, a little bit of the United States, but far less. It was a kind of Western dominance of bringing in branch campuses, because if the students didn't want to come to you, you better bring your programs or university. Many, by the way, have failed, have financially bankrupt. Some have been successful. And that's only one element, because then you have the franchise operations, you have the articulation programs, you have now binational universities, you have all kinds of different models. So there's not one model of transnational education. There are many different types that you are seeing, and you see increasingly that number growing. There's some concerns about the quality, and a recent study has shown that for instance, branch campuses like Nottingham in China, that they don't really provide the quality of the same level as what they do at home. That there are issues of language, for instance, and that Chinese students then speak Chinese among them, and instead of using English, and that all kind of quality control mechanisms. So there's not a perfect model there. We also see that increasingly countries that were recipients of in branch campuses and franchise operation now are doing the opposite. But China has branch campuses elsewhere. Egypt has a lot of branch campuses from abroad, but also has them in Africa. So we see also there a shift happening, and it's quite interesting to see that movement begin. But it's a very specific element, yeah, I think the reason why it is growing is partly because of, if you don't get the revenue from the international students going abroad, then you try to get the revenue when they come by setting up the branch campus. But it's a very complicated financial administration. But the internationalization at home is broader. So, and I prefer more and more not use that term internationalization at home, but talking about internationalization of the curriculum at home, or global learning for all students, because that expresses it much more specifically where you're focusing on, and what kind of. So if you look at the definition of internationalization curriculum of my friend and colleague Betty Lisk, she said that it's not only the content of the curriculum, but it is the learning outcomes, and what are the international and intercultural learning outcomes to define. How do you assess them? But also, how do you teach those learning outcomes, and then how do you support that? And the teaching side is quite interesting, because we have now again the digitalization as a possibility. So we can bring in foreign professors. We can bring in foreign students. We can have joint classrooms virtually. And we call that in the American context collaborative online international learning, COIL. And we see that that takes a big step forward, much more even outside of the United States, in Latin America and Africa, where students in the classroom are together, taught by faculty from different institutions, but also doing joint assignments outside of the classroom together. And that creates much more interaction between those students to learn from each other, not only content-wise, but also how do they learn? Are they taught? How do they live? What time is it the best way to meet together to write on a joint assignment? Time differences play a role, but also culture play a role. That kind of experience is also very important.
Thank you. Let me check the online questions. Okay, we have 4 now. So I'll read the questions. First one is, how would you, Professor Hans de Wit, how would you see the different disciplines, STEM versus humanities and social sciences, being affected differently by the anti-internationalization in recent years? I will read them all. Second one is, Western institutions have largely shaped what we consider internationalization in higher education, but this has often meant exporting Western epistemologies and knowledge systems globally. How do you see indigenous scholars and non-Western knowledge production challenging this paradigm? Are we moving toward genuinely epistemic pluralism, or is internationalization still fundamentally an extension of Western academic hegemony? And finally, we have, thank you for your fascinating sharing, an era of the 4th Industrial Revolution and the 6th distinction boundary crossing, the human and non-human. If internationalization is coming to an end by serving the outdated modern territorial boundary nationalist of power for colonization, how could higher education, spatial imagination, and discursive material power against the decreasing democracy and eroded liberal international order be transformed through planetary social imaginations like planetarization alternative? Thank you. Let's start from first, probably. 3 big questions.
3 big questions. The first one, I think that's a very important question. So we don't talk enough about disciplinary differences. So internationalization means quite something different when you talk about STEM fields or when you talk about humanities and social sciences. And in the STEM fields, there's much more going on, both in the research side and also at the graduate level. There's much more international movements happening. It's much more critical in the social sciences and humanities, also, and increasingly in the current context, because the geopolitical and the also anti-science movement, which affects much more social science and humanities than the sciences itself. But maybe with some exceptions like climate change research, but that's very interdisciplinary anyway. International collaboration in sciences is so essential because you cannot, the complex research in those fields requires that you have to collaborate, that you have to work together. So there it is, I think, not so much in danger as it could be in the social science humanities, where in general we are not so international social science and humanities anyway than in the sciences, but also it's much more focused on local context and local developments, and not so much on international. There's even some concern that the pressure of research on social science and humanities to be publishing in international journals is distracting it from addressing local needs, and that researchers, in particular in countries which are not English speaking, there's a big concern that the sociologists and political scientists and economists are not so much more focusing on the local context, but are only focusing on how can we get our publication in top journals. So finding the right balance there is in social science and humanities between still learning from international experience and addressing at the same time local issues is important. But international collaboration should be important in all fields, in my view. Let's say the second one. But yeah, I mentioned that briefly in my discourse. I see this trend that indeed Western dominance in higher education in general, and also an internationalization of higher education, is still there, and I don't think it will easily be moving away. I mean, we have seen the discussion that even in sciences, and if we go about sciences, China already has surpassed the United States and Europe. So in that sense, that become more dominant. But overall, the dominance of the Western model in higher education is still very hegemonic and is under attack, but it goes very slowly to change. The whole discourse about decolonization and indigenization is in itself a positive development. But at the same time, and that related to the question was asked before, if it looks to, if it makes you inward looking there and only think, well, we have to look at the local context and we have not to internationalize, that's also not good. So I had a whole debate with a colleague from Africa, Demte Tefera, about Africanization and internationalization, where there's this trend in Africa to say, well, indeed, we are very much dominated by the Western world. We have to create a kind of Africanization and looking inward and developing our context. In itself, that's very good. Maybe even more important in Africa, because most of the faculty and scholars in Africa are trained in the Western world, so that they look much more at the local context is important. But if it means that you're not collaborating internationally anymore, you don't learn from all the experiences. So finding the right balance between more attention to indigenous developments and the international one, collaboration is very essential. And that, I think, relates a little bit to the third question as well.
I'm sorry, may I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
What about the labeling itself? I mean, Africanization, what do we mean by it? Because we have the sub-Saharan Africa that's quite different from the North Africa. So how does Africanism even would mean, considering these differences? It's like pretty much considering Europe all the same, when we know that although we have a lot of cultural, social issues in common, we also have quite a lot of differences. So how would that pan out even?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, even between the North and the South, but you have French speaking, you have Portuguese speaking, and you have English speaking Africa as well. And they don't communicate with each other. So that's a challenge also. So Africanization and to see that regionalization, although I think it is important to have a regional policy for higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that what has been happening in Europe in the sense of the European programs and the Bologna process has been very important, not only to inward looking, but also to look at how you can collaborate with the rest of the world. And I see similar development in ASEAN happening. Elsewhere, it is very unsuccessful. Latin America, which you think you have a common language even. They don't talk to each other, they don't collaborate with each other, and starting a little bit now. And Africa is also a big problem. So indeed, Africanization, you can question. There are sub-regional collaborations which are much more important there.
Right. Sense.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I try to. And it relates a little bit to a provocative essay that I wrote with a German colleague, I think in 2011, if I remember, The End of Internationalization, where we said, well, indeed, internationalization is too much of a Western paradigm. Internationalization is very much focused on revenue generation and marketization and competition. And if you mean that with internationalization, then it should end. And that got a lot of responses and attention to us. I think there is, on the one hand, a big risk if we describe what I mentioned before about what is happening in the political arena, what is happening with our societies in general and climate change, that internationalization is under severe threat. That is absolutely true. At the same time, I see a counter movement. I see that internationalization is much more important in China. I mean, I was pretty impressed by the way how much attention there was to internationalization in China. You see similar discussions in India. I see similar discussions in Latin America and in Africa even, where they say, well, we are maybe now discovering how important it is that we are moving away from being dependency oriented, so being dependent on what is happening in the global north, and we have to develop our own internationalization. So I think the movement and the changes, the innovation of internationalization and of higher education come now much more from low and mid-income countries than they come from high-income countries, which still have a tendency to be much more concerned about security issues, much more concerned about their own context, etc. But it will take time to change. So I don't know if I completely answered that question, but
Thank you very much. That leaves us to only 2 more minutes. If we have, we can have one more question from Lili.
For your insightful presentation for us. And I remember that you mentioned that the academic and cultural values should be the key factors of internationalization. But I'm wondering, do you think not for now we pay more attention to the knowledge level or the scientific knowledge level rather than other cultural values, such as we have Confucian ideas or Taoist ideas from Asia, and we also have other traditional intellectual resources from Latin American and Africa. So I'm wondering, what's your opinion about what's the role of those cultural values in the internationalization, and how can we take good use of internationalization for the exchanges of these diverse cultural values? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that's very essential. And we have to understand that cultural values are different in different cultural backgrounds. And so when we talk about what is autonomy, what is academic freedom, what is critical thinking, what is higher education, is so defined by different cultural, historical contexts, that if we are saying that there's only one model that fits all, and that's the Western model, then there's something wrong. So we have to understand that there are differences. That's also why it's so important to internationalize the curriculum, that students understand that something what means education in the Chinese context is different than what you mean education in the American context. Even what education is in the American context is quite different than in the European context. So understanding that and learning about those differences is very essential. And we have an inclination not to do that, not only in the Western world, but also many of the people have been trained in the Western world who are working in academia and in the global South, also have much more incorporated that kind of thinking about that is what the true model of education, the values of education are. So we have to understand much more our differences, and only if we understand our differences we can see what can we do together and how can we learn from each other and move things forward. And critical thinking in that is very essential. That's also why we have to develop students also as critical thinkers, to think outside of the box and think, well, this is my value, what I've been trained in, what I've been lived in, but what can I see that the other ones do? So.
Okay, thank you very much. It seems that we have agreed that internationalization does not equal and should not be westernization or universalization, even though that there's still a big unsolved room and space for us to explore what is the diversity and how do we develop diverse approaches. Definition, not necessarily not definitions, but directions for future internationalization of higher education or international higher education. Okay, before we finally call it an off as a day, and then may I invite our dean?
Yes, I don't want to say anything formally. I actually want to ask Hans to reflect or ask for his own reflections. Really push him. In your eyes, because you have been to so many universities within the past few days, what impressed you? What kind of problem with China's internationalization? Problems. That's one thing I want. We can talk more about this during lunch. Another is, to the Chinese colleagues, they are fairly elite, those you have met. To those people, you are more Dutch or you are more American. I actually think, I think in their eyes, you are American rather than Dutch.
You think that I'm more American than Dutch?
I don't think so. They think you are. I mean, they think you are an American professor coming from.
Yeah.
The American is not Trump America. The American is American elite universities. It's not Trump America. It's different.
Well, yeah, on that last part, I mean, I personally think that I'm more Dutch than I'm American, but of course I'm much more direct than most Americans are. And I think also that's what both my American colleagues and also the Chinese colleagues appreciate, that I'm not moving away from trying to be politically correct or whatever, but saying what I think is important to say. But on your first part, well, yeah, I mean, you're right that I talked, of course, mainly to the top scholars and the top PhD students and in the top universities in China. And I'm always impressed with that they still are looking very much at the Western world. And so if I come, then I'm indeed the American professor or the professor from an American university that comes to tell about internationalization. And I start thinking, but no, I'm much more interested in the discussion you would have on what your views are than trying to impose my views. And I think that's still, I think the main challenge that Chinese scholars have. They have also to move away from thinking that the Western model is so essential, and that they have to embed themselves much more in the local context. They have a big advantage because they are much more numerous. I mean, I'm impressed by the numbers of PhD students there are and the faculty there are in all those different universities that I've been attending. They all have in high school and higher education. I mean, if you look at the United States, let's be honest, without our center and then a few others in California at Berkeley and Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Michigan, and most of them, higher education is very American higher education. And even in Europe, there are very few centers of higher education research, and even then with an international component. So in that sense, there is an enormous opportunity for Chinese scholars and for to work there. At the same time, how can you guarantee the quality of that? There's still a very strong focus on we have to publish in the top A and A- and A+ journals, and students have to work extremely hard. Faculty, I mean, I'm amazed how you even can manage to work like 15 hours a day. And is that very productive? Is that very efficient to do? I wonder about that. And I told them I cannot understand why that is. That even if I go like in a J.W.M University in the weekend and you see scholars working on Saturday and on Sunday, and that can at the end not be productive. You have to relax sometimes. You have to think out of things. And so I think there are some serious challenges. There are also a challenge that there might be too many PhD students graduating, and there is a big concern. I mean, if I talk to students, the main concern is, do you find a job? And most of them will not find an academic job, and that's why you have to prepare also PhD students for other jobs than going into academia, and that's already a long time the case in other countries. So that, I mean, there are many positive things to say about what is happening in mainland China, but there are also big concerns.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. Let's give another round of applause. I hope you enjoy your visit in Hong Kong.
Absolutely.
So lunch is 12:30.